Kharkiv entered the summer of 1941 as a regional center whose value exceeded its administrative borders. With a 1939 population near 900,000 and an industrial belt anchored by factory number 183, Kharkiv locomotive plant, producing T-34 components before relocation, electrical and machine tool works, and a developed food processing sector, the city stood at the seam of the Ukrainian steppe and the Donets Basin. Rail lines linked it to Moscow via Kursk, to the Donbass through Lozova, to the Dnipro corridor through Poltava, and eastward to Kupiansk, and further into the Soviet rear. This network made Kharkiv a natural collection point for fuel, grain, and coal moving west and north, and a dispatch node for troops and heavy equipment. Its significance was geographic as much as industrial. Whoever held Kharkiv could shuttle divisions along multiple axes faster than an opponent forced to detour. The geopolitical context that drove military planning toward Kharkiv formed earlier than the opening shots of June 22, 1941. German leadership, concluding from the 1918 experience that prolonged attrition risked economic collapse, sought a campaign built around encirclements, seizure of resource basins, and the destruction of Soviet field armies west of the Dnipro. Army Group South was oriented on Ukraine's agricultural output, the Donbass coal basin, and the approach routes to the lower Volga and Caucasus. For this headquarters, Kharkiv was both a milestone on the line to the Donbass and a hinge for operations toward Kursk and Voronezh. Soviet leadership, reading the same terrain from the opposite direction, viewed Kharkiv as a forward industrial city whose rail capacity and workshops could anchor counterstrokes into northern Ukraine and defend the approach to the Middle Volga. In pre-war mobilization tables, the Southwestern Front relied on the Kharkiv node to concentrate and refit mechanized corps depleted by marches and breakdowns. Intelligence estimates on both sides contain gaps with direct consequences for how Kharkiv would be approached and defended. German assessments of Red Army depth and reconstitution underestimated the number of rifle divisions and tank brigades that could be raised and inserted after initial defeats. Soviet estimates, shaped by the purge's impact on staff work and by late-spring reorganization of mechanized forces, overstated the readiness of large armored formations, whose equipment and maintenance units were still dispersed. Reports in June-July listed significant numbers of tanks on paper, but usable vehicles after long road marches were lower, and rail lift for rapid redeployment competed with evacuation traffic. Thus, from the first weeks, Kharkiv's rail yards became a junction not only for reinforcement, but for removal. Machine tools, foundry cores, and skilled workers were put on trains bound for the Middle Volga and the Urals under orders issued as the front line approached. Public sentiment within the city reflected these structural pressures more than any single narrative. Factory committees received directives to prepare crating and manifests for high-value equipment. Municipal authorities organized air raid shelters and rationing. Families faced choices between evacuation on crowded eastbound trains and remaining in neighborhoods near plants that might be targets. For local party and NKPS railway officials, the working assumption by late July was that the city could neither be secured by ad hoc fortifications alone, nor abandoned without first extracting assets critical to national production. For soldiers of the Southwestern Front, who had already experienced encirclements at Uman and later at Kiev, Kharkiv was a rear space for reconstitution and a probable future battlefield. For German field commands, Kharkiv appeared in operations diaries as an objective whose capture would reorder the Soviet rail lattice in Ukraine and free divisions for a push toward the Donets. Military preparedness around Kharkiv in the months before the front reached it lay at the intersection of doctrine and logistics. German doctrine emphasized rapid breakthroughs by panzer and motorized formations, followed by infantry armies completing pockets. This required fuel columns, bridging units, and repair echelons to keep pace across long step approaches where roads were limited and dust-degraded engines. Soviet doctrine in 1941 still envisioned counterblows by mechanized corps, but the practical defense of Kharkiv increasingly relied on rifle divisions with reduced artillery transport, hastily sighted anti-tank guns, and workers' battalions assigned to fieldworks along western approaches. Ammunition allotments and fuel dumps were moved repeatedly to avoid air attack, trading security for delays in distribution. Allied and Axis coalition dynamics influenced the city's fate indirectly but measurably. Hungarian and Italian formations aligned to Army Group South assumed sectors that freed German divisions for the drive on major Ukrainian cities. This economy of force in the wider theater made a concentrated thrust toward Kharkiv more feasible. On the Soviet side, the integration of evacuated industry into new plants in Nizhny Tagil and elsewhere promised eventual compensation for losses. But the transition period left gaps in spare parts and armored vehicle output that affected unit readiness in the Kharkiv sector during winter and spring rotations. Within this matrix of plans, misreadings, and material constraints, Kharkiv's near future as a city that wouldn't stay won took shape. The same rail and road geometry that gave the city operational value also exposed it to repeated convergences of offensives and counteroffensives. Commanders on both sides viewed it simultaneously as prize and trap, a place where capturing depots and yards could enable further advances, yet where overstretched spearheads risked counter-encirclement if reserves arrived by the very lines just seized. Civilians, whose daily mobility depended on the same infrastructure, encountered the military logic as timetable disruptions, curfews, requisitions, and the uncertainties of identity documents, employment assignments, and housing amid evacuation waves. By early autumn 1941, the front's west-to-east drift placed Kharkiv within the radius of daily air reconnaissance and interdiction. The city's initial defenses were not framed as a final stand, but as a delaying structure to balance two goals: remove portable industry and maintain through traffic long enough to move formations and equipment east. German staffs planned to convert the node quickly for their own use, expecting bridges and yards to be captured intact or repaired within set engineer timeframes. Both assumptions would be tested in the months ahead, setting the pattern for later cycles when the city changed hands again. The preconditions were thus established: a high-value rail hub, opposing doctrines dependent on movement through that hub, and a civilian population whose choices were constrained by the same tracks, sidings, and schedules that made Kharkiv a strategic pivot. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the German invasion turned Kharkiv from a rear industrial city into a probable operational objective. In the southern theater, the initial command structure placed Army Group South under Gerd von Rundstedt, with 6th Army and 17th Army as the main infantry groupings, and 1st Panzer Group providing mobile thrusts. Allied formations from Romania and, later, Hungary and Italy assumed flanking and occupation roles. Opposite them, the Southwestern Front coordinated Soviet forces along the Kyiv-Kharkiv axis, with reserve echelons assigned to the Kharkiv rail node for rebuilding and counterstroke planning. The first weeks did not bring fighting to Kharkiv itself, but they determined how and when the city would be approached. Breakthroughs west of the Dnipro forced successive Soviet withdrawals and tied rail capacity to evacuation, reinforcement, and fuel delivery under air attack. The Kyiv encirclement in September 1941 removed large Soviet formations and altered the geometry of the front. With Soviet field armies west of the Dnipro destroyed or scattered, the German 6th Army gained room to pivot east. Kharkiv entered operations diaries as a near-term objective, whose seizure promised a rail junction for the Donbass and a base for further advances toward the Don and lower Volga. Luftwaffe reconnaissance emphasized yards at Osnova and the junctions toward Poltava and Lozova, while ground echelons planned for bridging, repair units, and fuel dumps to exploit capture. For Soviet staffs, the loss of Kyiv raised the priority of protecting industrial assets and lines feeding the Voronezh-Kursk corridor. Orders expanded evacuation lists from high-value machine tools to casting cores, precision gauges, and skilled personnel. The city's factories, including the locomotive armor complex that had produced T-34 components, prepared serial numbers, crate lists, and routing plans, while municipal authorities organized eastbound trains through Kupiansk. Initial movements toward Kharkiv unfolded along two belts. North of the city, German infantry pressed on the Sumy-Belgorod approach, aiming to compromise the Moscow rail link. South of it, Mobile units probed through Krasnohrad and toward Lozova to sever connections with the Donbass. Soviet rifle divisions, reinforced by workers' detachments, constructed fieldworks on the western approaches, while anti-aircraft units redistributed guns to protect marshalling yards and bridges. The defensive scheme assumed a delay rather than a static stand. Time gained would be used to clear plant floors, reroute stocks, and push reserve formations toward the Donets line. Railway timetables reflected competing priorities. Trains carrying factory equipment had loading windows measured in hours. Troop movements required blocks of contiguous track. Air raid damage demanded detours that lengthened both schedules. Civilians faced the same constraints, with seats and freight space allocated by lists that changed daily. Command decisions on both sides reflected uncertainty about the pace of collapse and recovery. German staffs expected reduced Soviet resistance after Kharkiv, but still planned for strong points around cities. Supply directives warned against outpacing fuel deliveries on long step roads. Soviet command anticipated renewed armored counterstrokes, yet available mobile brigades were limited by mechanical attrition and shortages of spare parts during relocation. Where doctrine called for combined arms maneuver, practice devolved into delaying actions by rifle units supported by whatever anti-tank and artillery assets could be sighted along likely approaches. The city's airspace saw periodic raids and interceptions rather than sustained campaigns. The goal was to pressure yards and roads enough to slow movement without diverting scarce aircraft from broader front tasks. By early October 1941, forward German elements were within operational reach of Kharkiv's outer defenses. The approach combined methodical infantry advances with limited armored exploitation to avoid isolated spearheads. Bridges and switching yards were targeted for quick seizure intact. Engineers assigned demolition guards to prevent Soviet destruction where possible. Soviet rear services expanded demolition plans, assigning charges and firing schedules to bridge teams, substations, and depots, with the intent to deny immediate use even if the city changed hands. Factory administrations moved remaining machine tools onto flat cars, left heavy foundations and bulky furnaces, and transferred design bureaus and foremen east. The departure of specialized workers reshaped the city's labor market overnight. Workshops that had supported rail repairs received new tasks, while rationing tightened as food stocks were redirected to mobile columns and evacuees. On the military side, the last Soviet formations west of the city attempted to hold a line that would protect both the northern and southern rail exits. Holding both proved difficult once German units reached the crossings on the Udi and Lopan. Local counterattacks were launched to restore rail flow for a few days at a time. These actions traded battalion-level casualties for additional evacuation trains and the removal of fuel stocks that would otherwise be captured. The German Sixth Army's plan continued to emphasize a rolling encirclement rather than a frontal assault, using pressure on road junctions to force withdrawals and to minimize damage to infrastructure needed for subsequent advances toward the Donets. Administrative transitions began even before total control of the city center changed. German occupation authorities assembled lists of industrial sites, warehouses, and municipal offices to be secured by rear area units once combat formations moved through. Soviet urban governance shifted to wartime procedures that combined policing, civil defense, and triage of essential services. Public notices changed quickly, first to direct blackout and water use limits, then to announce closure of schools and redistribution of work brigades toward fortification and railway tasks. The effect for residents was a narrowing of options. In some districts, families sent a working-age member east, while older relatives remained to protect apartments and possessions. In others, whole households boarded evacuation trains with limited baggage and uncertain destinations. The entry of German infantry into Kharkiv on October 24th to 25th, 1941, concluded the opening phase with results that were operationally advantageous for the attackers, but incomplete by their own planning metrics. Many facilities were captured damaged or empty. Rail yards required repair before they could sustain multi-army supply. For the Soviet side, the city's loss imposed a new geometry of defense tied to the Donets and the approaches to Voronezh, but it preserved a portion of the industrial base through evacuation. Both commands drew immediate lessons. German staff reports highlighted the need for faster engineer deployment to restore yards and bridges, and urged tighter fuel discipline to support long eastward lines. Soviet reports emphasized the necessity of deeper field fortifications east of the city and the integration of newly formed rifle divisions with surviving cadres. Throughout these steps, civilian patterns adapted to new rules. Identification checks, curfews, and requisitions reshaped daily routines, while markets attempted to reorganize under scarcity and price controls. The city's role as a rail hub continued, now oriented to the occupiers' logistics and to surviving local needs, with freight priorities reordered to support forward depots. As the front stabilized eastward for the winter, Kharkiv became both an asset and a liability, a base for supply and administration under occupation, and a future objective for forces gathering beyond the Don area. The sequence of movements, orders, and transitions from June to late October set the template for later reversals. The same lines that carried victory trains in one direction could, with altered control of junctions, carry retreat columns in the other. After the October 1941 capture, German planning treated Kharkiv as a logistics hinge for winter operations and as a springboard for the 1942 campaign. 6th Army projected the city to support two axes, east along the Kupiansk-WWII rail for pressure on the Don line and south via Lozova for the Donbass. Economic staff. East and Army Group, South Quartermaster sections issued seizure and repair schedules. Railroad pioneer battalions began converting 1,520 mm track to 1,435 mm standard gauge at rates between 20 and 30 kilometers per day, where bridges were intact, slower where spans on the Lopan and Udi required replacement. Preliminary targets set Kharkiv yards to handle 24 to 28 military trains daily. By January 1942, each train calculated at 600 to 800 tons gross, with fuel columns prioritized to reach forward depots at Izium and Kupiansk. Ammunition planning allocated 6th Army roughly 1.2 to 1.5 basic loads per division for a static winter front, with reserve stock staged near Poltava to hedge against interdiction. Command arrangements placed 6th Army under Friedrich Paulus with 3 corps groupings around the city perimeter, and rear security units tasked with depots, bridges, and administrative nodes. Luftwaffe field commands assigned limited bomber sorties to rail interdiction beyond the Donets and to anti-partisan sweeps along the Belgorod line. Fighter cover was prioritized for daylight freight corridors. Engineer directives emphasized rapid replacement of switching equipment and repair of water towers needed for steam locomotives. Repair shops requisitioned skilled metal workers from city plants, while occupation ordinances established labor registers, ration scales tied to work category, and curfews synchronized with freight movements. Police and rear area commands coordinated identification checks at stations to reduce pilferage of consignments designated for Army supply. Parallel to these measures, Soviet planning reframed Kharkiv as a future offensive objective, while consolidating a defensive belt east of the Donets. The southwestern direction under Semyon Timoshenko, with Georgy Zhukov as Stavka representative through late 1941, set 3 short-term priorities: stabilize the front on the Oskol-Donets line, restore rail flow through Veluiki and Voronezh to feed reinforcement, and reconstitute armored brigades from evacuated factories now restarting in the Urals. By January 1942, the Kharkiv sector was supplied through Kupiansk yard groups, handling approximately 12 to 16 trains daily, lower than pre-war capacity due to damaged bridges and shortage of locomotives. Rifle divisions brought up to the line averaged 6,500 to 8,500 personnel, against a table of 10,000 to 12,000, with artillery below scale and limited motor transport. Newly formed tank brigades fielded mixed equipment, T-30 and KV-1s from relocated lines, plus T-60 and T-70 with shorter range. Maintenance units faced parts shortages that influenced operational planning as much as manpower totals. Strategically, both sides designed spring plans that made Kharkiv central for different reasons. The German concept that evolved into Case Blue anticipated a drive to the Don and Volga and a turn toward the Caucasus oil fields. To secure the left flank before the main offensive, 6th Army and 1st Panzer Army sought to eliminate the Soviet Barvenkovo salient west of the Donets and prevent an attack on the Kharkiv rail hub. Their staff appreciations assessed Soviet strength opposite the city as substantial but brittle, with many formations newly raised and dependent on limited bridgeheads. Fuel allocations forecasted armored operations of 150 to 250 kilometers over 2 weeks, if rail repair stayed on schedule and weather allowed firm road surfaces by late May. The Soviet plan for a Kharkiv offensive, approved in April-May 1942, aimed to compress the Kharkiv garrison from south and north, cut the Lozova rail, and encircle German forces west of the Donets. Southwest Front and Southern Front prepared a converging attack from the Barvenkovo-Izium bridgehead and from the Volchansk sector. Planning documents counted roughly 640,000 personnel, about 9,000 to 9,200 guns and mortars, and 1,000 to 1,200 tanks distributed among armies assigned to the operation. Air support envisaged over 500 operational aircraft, subject to serviceability and fuel. Logistics tables scheduled daily deliveries of 1,500 to 2,000 tons of ammunition and fuel across the Donets, with pontoon parks and ferries reinforcing existing bridges. Reserve echelons included cavalry corps and rifle divisions to exploit a breakthrough toward Marefa and Lyubotin. Staff assumptions projected a 7 to 10-day operation, with the city encircled by cutting the rail arcs rather than by a direct urban assault. Miscalculations were embedded on both sides. German intelligence appreciated the existence of the Barvenkovo salient, but underestimated the density of Soviet artillery in the bridgehead and the scale of the northern pincer. At the same time, supply officers warned that Kharkiv yards were not yet at planned throughput. Locomotive shortages and wagon turnarounds remained below target, creating risk if simultaneous operations drew on the same depots. Soviet planners, for their part, assumed German mobile reserves near Kharkiv were limited, and that Luftwaffe interdiction could be contained by concentrated fighter cover during crossing windows. The timetable for building second echelon bridges lagged due to ice damage and current, compressing the margin for sustained fuel flow if operations extended beyond the first week. Doctrinal frameworks shaped the design of both plans. German use of flexible defense and counterstroke relied on holding prepared lines with infantry, while mobile groups launched flank attacks once the Soviet offensive committed its main forces. Corps boundary adjustments around Kharkiv in April redistributed artillery to sectors with likely Soviet crossings, and positioned assault gun units to engage at short range along roads radiating from Izium. Soviet doctrine, reworked after winter operations, emphasized artillery preparation, concentrated armor on narrow sectors, and immediate exploitation into depth to prevent enemy reserves from forming a coherent second line. For the Kharkiv operation, this meant massing artillery in the Barvenkovo bend and synchronizing the northern offensive to arrive on the German rear within the same time window. Propaganda and public messaging accompanied the planning cycle. German communiques presented Kharkiv as a base for reconstructing normal life under new administration and as proof of rail restoration capacity. Posters and radio messages stressed reopening of markets and work brigades while emphasizing registration and order. Soviet media framed the sector as a future site of counterblow, linking successful evacuation of industry to the ability to arm new units. Internal directives instructed party organizations near Kupiansk and WWII to maintain morale with concrete metrics. Numbers of repaired locomotives, trains dispatched, and shipments of tanks from Urals plants, rather than general slogans. Civilian administration factored into operational readiness. Occupation authorities to set ration scales of roughly 1,500 to 2,000 calories for registered heavy laborers, lower for dependents, and integrated workshops into repair chains for rolling stock and field kitchens. Housing committees allocated barracks for railway crews to keep shifts aligned with freight schedules. On the Soviet side of the line, Civil defense prepared evacuation plans for villages along likely artillery arcs, with wagon columns and limited motor transport earmarked for medical stations and ammunition parks. The placement of ambulance trains and casualty evacuation routes was tied directly to the two planned crossing sectors, anticipating high traffic that could interfere with resupply if not segregated. By late April 1942, both plans were in position. 6th Army completed additional field works west and southwest of Kharkiv, and concentrated counterattack forces behind the expected Soviet salients. Southwest and southern fronts finished their artillery grouping and built up forward dumps to sustain at least a week of high expenditure. Weather reports showed firming ground but warned of dust that could reduce engine reliability and visibility. The operational map condensed the broader war into a narrow zone where rail spurs, bridges, and a city designed as a connector would again determine the scale and direction of movement. The goals were clear in staff terms. For the German side, hold, bleed the offensive, and then cut off the Barvenkovo bulge. For the Soviet side, breach, sever the rail ring, and force the city into an encirclement. The assumptions behind these goals would be tested within days when artillery clocks signaled the opening barrage. The opening artillery preparation began at 4:30 on May 12, 1942, when Southwest Front and Southern Front fired along a 50-kilometer arc from Volchansk to the Barvenkovo Bend. Assault groups crossed the Seversky Done on pre-assembled pontoon sections and captured bridgeheads at Chugiev and south of Balaklia. Initial daily objectives aimed for 10 to 15-kilometer penetrations to sever the Lozova and Marefa rail arcs that fed German depots around Kharkiv. Force ratios in the forward echelons favored the attackers, approximately 765,300 Soviet personnel, with about 1,176 tanks and 926 operational aircraft, were massed for the operation against Axis groupings of roughly 350,000 personnel, 447 tanks, and about 591 aircraft in the immediate theater. These figures set expectations of a short encirclement rather than prolonged urban fighting. Wikipedia. On the northern wing, armies pushing from the Volchansk sector forced German infantry back from prepared outposts toward intermediate lines covering the Belgorod Railway. Forward detachments reported villages changing hands several times in a day, as the attackers tried to pry open corridors wide enough for tank brigades to pass. South of Kharkiv, formations advancing out of the Barvenkovo salient punched through first-line positions near Proto-Popivka and Mayaki. By evening of May 13th, several Soviet spearheads were 10 to 25 kilometers beyond their start lines, but the gaps between assault axes complicated lateral support and ammunition resupply across the river crossings. Soviet staff logs recorded heavy usage of pontoon parks and ferries to push 1,500 to 2,000 tons per day, but current and air interdiction periodically halted traffic, creating uneven fuel levels among the leading brigades. In Kharkiv itself, then under German occupation, the first days of the Soviet offensive were experienced as a pattern of alerts, rail disruptions, and requisition surges. Luftwaffe fighter cover shifted toward the rail lines south and southeast, leaving the city with reduced patrol density during parts of the day, while bomber sorties targeted crossings east of Izium. Civil defense instructions ordered residents to carry identification, avoid marshalling yards, and travel only with work permits. Ration scales for registered laborers remained tied to railway and repair tasks. The city's yards managed to dispatch and receive fewer trains than the winter target of 24 to 28 per day, as priority spurs were held for ammunition and fuel trains heading to 6th Army's sector depots. German frontline reports during May 12th to 14th stressed holding actions combined with immediate counterattacks at company and battalion scale to disrupt Soviet bridgehead expansion. Assault gun batteries and local reserves struck at the shoulders of penetrations to prevent a continuous breakthrough front. 6th Army and 1st Panzer Army redeployed mobile reserves toward the Barvenkovo shoulder, reasoning that the salient's base offered the best opportunity for a double envelopment once the Soviet offensive committed its depth. Supply directives limited long road moves by panzer regiments until additional fuel reached forward dumps from Poltava and Lozova. The operational concept that would become Operation Fridericus, pinning the Soviet advance, then cutting the salient, was refined in these first engagements as artillery registered crossing sites and air reconnaissance mapped traffic on the pontoon routes. Soviet assault brigades on the southern axis combined T-34s and KV-1s with lighter T-60Is and T-70Is. In the opening 2 days, armor achieved several local overruns of infantry strongpoints, but encountered minefields and 88mm guns sighted to cover road approaches to Marefa and Lyubotin. On the northern axis, infantry divisions reported success in village fighting, but slower progress on open ground where anti-tank gun belts forced detours. Air support sorties rose on May 13th to 14th to cover the crossings. However, serviceability rates constrained sustained presence over both wings simultaneously. The operational plan required simultaneous pressure north and south to compress the German defense around Kharkiv. In practice, tempo diverged between sectors as bridging capacity and ammunition. Supply varied hour by hour. By May 14th, Soviet forward elements reported contact with German second-line defenses in multiple sectors, including strongpoints shielding the Lozova rail. Prisoner interrogations indicated the arrival of fresh German reserves and repositioned anti-tank assets. Staff reviews for the night of May 14th to 15th recommended reinforcing the Barvenkovo thrust to accelerate a cut of the Kharkiv-Lozova line, but bridging columns reported strain. One pontoon set lost to artillery fire, several ferries grounded by shifting banks, and a backlog of tanks and trucks waiting to cross. Weather was clear, aiding air interdiction. Dust on unpaved approaches increased engine wear and reduced convoy speeds. The result was a front whose map lines showed gains, while the logistics tables showed growing variance between fuel on hand and planned consumption for exploitation. German countermeasures in these days focused on stabilizing a bend along the Seversky Donets and testing the flanks of Soviet penetrations with concentrated armor. Reports for May 15th noted that German mobile groups executed short thrusts that cut Soviet forward detachments from their bridging support, forcing withdrawals to maintain supply contact. Kharkiv's depots sent additional anti-tank ammunition and engineer stores forward. Rail conversion teams continued gauge work on captured stretches to improve throughput from the west. Even with these measures, daily Axis capacity figures remained below pre-offensive goals, and fuel allocation required trade-offs between counterattack timing and the need to keep infantry divisions stocked for continuous defense. For civilians in zones where the front shifted, the first engagements produced rapid changes in control. Villages south of the city saw short-term evacuations to avoid artillery arcs. Field hospitals and ambulance trains took precedence on roads that previously carried market traffic. In Kharkiv, administration offices expanded shelter hours and adjusted blackout schedules. Work teams rotated through longer shifts in rail repair shops to meet dispatch targets. The presence of wounded in station areas and the movement of captured soldiers through transit points made the offensive visible even to those without access to front reports. By May 16th, the Soviet northern thrust had not yet linked operationally with the southern advance, leaving a corridor west of Izium where German planners expected to launch a counterstroke. The attackers held multiple bridgeheads and had inflicted documented losses on forward German regiments, but the widening of the penetration necessary to encircle Kharkiv had not occurred. Axis intelligence assessed Soviet totals as high, but noted signals traffic indicating supply strain. Both sides registered tactical successes measured in villages taken or retaken and guns silenced, yet the broader operational picture pointed toward a test of endurance at the crossing sites and along the road nets feeding them. Within 2 days, the counteroffensive plan from the south would attempt to close the salient's base and transform these initial engagements into an encirclement battle. At 7 a.m. on May 17, 1942, German mobile groups struck the southern shoulder of the Barvenkovo salient between Andriivka and Petrovskoye. 1st Panzer Army assembled composite spearheads built around the 14th Panzer Division, the 16th Panzer Division, and the 60th Motorized Division, with attached assault guns and engineers for rapid breach work. Simultaneously, 6th Army tightened the northern arc near Balaklia and Chugayev with infantry corps and local armor. The aim was to cut the salient's base, split Southwest Front's attacking armies, and force withdrawals across congested bridges on the Seversky Donets. The force balance along the southern sector now shifted. German mobile elements committed roughly 200 to 250 operational tanks and assault guns for the opening thrusts, supported by Luftflotte, Force bomber and dive bomber groups concentrated against crossings and artillery parks. Opposite them, Soviet formations on the salient's base included 9th Army and 57th Army, with several tank brigades, totaling several hundred tanks on paper, but with lower serviceability due to fuel and maintenance delays after days of attack. Terrain and road conditions favored the counterstroke once the initial line was breached. The steppe approaches south of Barvenkovo offered long fields of fire and multiple farm track cutoffs to outflank strongpoints. German spearheads exploited gaps between Soviet rifle divisions that had oriented forward to support the May 12th to 16th advance. By evening on May 17th, village positions at Bayrak and Savinci changed hands, and a wedge 10 to 15 kilometers deep threatened the main east-west road used to feed the salient. Soviet staff orders directed immediate counterattacks with available tank brigades, but bridge traffic on the Donets limited the rate at which fuel and ammunition could be pushed to forward depots. Several brigades entered combat below planned stock levels. Air power magnified these logistical stresses. Bomber concentrations targeted ferries and pontoon sets east of Izium and south of Balaklia, forcing repair cycles and temporary closures. Soviet fighter groups increased sorties to cover crossing windows, yet serviceable aircraft numbers and pilot fatigue constrained continuous coverage. Daily throughput across the river, planned at 1,500 to 2,000 tons, fluctuated below target. Withdrawals to restore supply contact opened seams that German reconnaissance quickly recognized. Night movements reduced exposure, but slowed the redeployment of artillery and anti-tank guns needed to hold the shoulders of the salient. On May 18th to 19th, 1st Panzer Army widened the breach and pivoted east, while 6th Army's infantry pressed from the north to fix Soviet formations in place. Soviet command employed reserve cavalry corps and additional rifle divisions to stall the southern advance and to buy time for a reorganization, the northern attack toward Volchansk. The result was a reshaped battle line. The northern thrust still held ground gained in the first days, but the southern base of the salient was narrowed to a corridor vulnerable to encirclement. Communications reflected the pressure. Field telephones were frequently cut. Reliance on radio increased, but batteries and spare parts were scarce in units that had advanced beyond the original logistics arc. Casualty reporting in these days indicated a rising cost on both sides, though at different scales. German corps summarized several thousand casualties from May 17th to 20th across the Kharkiv sector, with tank write-offs concentrated in units that fought against ambushes in village streets and mine belts on the approaches to Lozova. Soviet armies in the salient reported higher figures as battalions were committed piecemeal to hold roads and ridgelines. Tank brigades lost vehicles to anti-tank belts and to air attack when refueling near exposed crossings. Ammunition expenditure exceeded first-week estimates on both sides, particularly for anti-tank and field artillery, compelling rail echelons to prioritize specific calibers over others. Crisis management inside the salient centered on keeping open at least 2 parallel roads for supply and potential withdrawal. Staffs directed engineering units to prepare alternate fords and to mark routes for night movement. Fuel dumps were broken into smaller lots to reduce loss to airstrikes, but dispersal complicated rapid resupply. Requests for additional pontoon parks competed with requirements elsewhere on the front. Measures to bring up fresh formations faced the same bottlenecks. Replacement rifle regiments arrived under strength, and tank replacements were few. The Soviet Northern Group attempted to renew pressure toward Lyubotin to pull off German reserves, achieving local advances but not enough to slow the encircling movement from the south. Kharkiv city during May 18th to 20th functioned as a rear pivot for German operations, while absorbing the strain of higher traffic, Freight yards dispatched ammunition and fuel toward Lozova and Marifa, while repair shops worked extended shifts to return damaged rolling stock to service. Civilian administration tightened curfews, expanded shelter hours, and reallocated labor to track repair and depot handling. For residents, the offensive and counteroffensive translated into intermittent air alarms, restricted movement near stations, and visible flows of wounded and prisoners through transit points. Markets operated under rationing. Prices and availability shifted with train arrivals. By May 20th to 21st, German spearheads from the south approached positions where they could interdict eastbound roads from Barvenkovo. Sixth Army's continued pressure from the north restricted Soviet lateral movement. Attempts to re-establish a continuous defensive line at the salient's base produced intense local fighting around crossings and road junctions. Soviet command authorized withdrawals from exposed forward positions to shorten the front and to concentrate around prepared lines covering the remaining corridor. The tempo of air interdiction rose. Clear weather increased visibility for dive bomber attacks on bridges and columns. The encirclement closed between May 23rd and May 24th near Lozovenka, when mobile groups linked up after cutting the last serviceable road and rail tracks across the base. Inside the pocket, Soviet forces included elements of the 6th Army, the 57th Army, and supporting units. Estimates of personnel trapped ranged above 150,000. Outside the pocket, formations on the northern wing and east of the Donets attempted to break in, launching attacks that forced German units to divert reserves but did not reopen a corridor. Fighting within the pocket reorganized around attempts to form breakout groups carrying limited ammunition and fuel. Artillery units with depleted shells shifted to direct fire at short ranges to conserve stocks. Loss figures over the operation's full span point to an asymmetric outcome. Soviet casualties are assessed in the range of 200,000 to over 250,000 personnel across killed, wounded, and captured, with tank losses likely exceeding 800 to 1,000 vehicles and several thousand guns and mortars. German and Allied losses in the sector are generally recorded between 20,000 and 30,000 personnel, with lower tank write-offs and aircraft losses than their opponents. These numbers, compiled after action, reflected the cumulative effect of the encirclement rather than attrition at the initial front. They also shaped immediate strategic options. Axis mobile formations emerged with enough operational strength to proceed to the next phase of the summer plan. Soviet fronts faced the need to rebuild armies while stabilizing a new line on the east bank of the Donets. Command challenges during the crisis revealed recurring structural issues. German staffs noted fuel discipline as a persistent constraint on pursuit operations once the pocket closed. Priorities had to be set between sealing the encirclement and deep exploitation. Soviet staffs recorded delays in interfront coordination and pointed to the vulnerability of riverine logistics under concentrated air attack. Terrain and weather played roles consistent with the season. Dry conditions favored rapid movement, but increased dust-related engine wear. Riverbanks with limited crossing sites magnified the effect of bridge destruction. Morale reflected these material realities. German units reported high confidence after link-up. Soviet reports from outside the pocket emphasized determination to reconstitute and counterattack, while accounts from inside the pocket described disorganization as formations merged for breakout attempts. International and political reactions in this period were framed by the broader context of 1942. Axis communiques emphasized a defensive victory, followed by offensive potential. Soviet statements acknowledged a difficult situation, while stressing continued production and reinforcement enabled by evacuated industry. Allies noted the scale of the fighting around Kharkiv, but lacked the means for direct intervention on this front. In operational terms, the escalation and crisis around the city concluded with a sealed pocket and a repositioned front that set the conditions for the summer advance toward the Don and Volga. For Kharkiv, the immediate outcome was continued occupation, intensified logistical use of its rail net, and the prospect that the same lines now serving a successful counterstroke would again decide the tempo of the next campaign phase. The closing of the Barvenkovo pocket in late May 1942 left Kharkiv in Axis hands and reoriented it into a rear hub for Case Blue. During June-October 1942, Sixth Army, and later elements of 4th Panzer Army drew fuel, ammunition, and replacements through the Kharkiv node for the push across the Donets toward the Don and Volga. Repair battalions restored double-track segments and water stations. Converted stretches of standard gauge enabled a flow that averaged 18 to 24 trains daily into the theater, though capacity fluctuated with bridge work and locomotive availability. Depots at Merefa and Lozova fed forward supply points around Kupiansk and Valuiki, while field hospitals in the city handled a steady throughput of wounded. Civilian labor organized under occupation ordinances maintained track, workshops, and warehouses. Ration levels were tied to registered work categories. Through the second half of 1942, Kharkiv's streets saw fewer frontline troops than rail crews, mechanics, and medical staff, while the main fighting shifted hundreds of kilometers southeast. The strategic picture turned in winter 1942 to 43. The Soviet counteroffensive after Stalingrad forced Army Group A to disengage from the Caucasus and pressed Army Group Don and Army Group South along a wide front. On the Kharkiv axis, the Voronezh front under Philip Golikov prepared Operation Star, aimed at liberating the city and advancing on Belgorod and Poltava. Operational groupings included 40th Army, 69th Army, and 3rd Tank Army, collectively fielding over 200,000 personnel for the sector, with several hundred tanks and self-propelled guns and a comparable number of aircraft allocated across the front. Opposing them, German forces in and around Kharkiv drew on remnants of divisions withdrawn from the Middle Don, rear area troops, and formations refitting after the winter retreats. Mobile reserves were limited, with operational armor prioritized for holding corridors further south. The offensive opened in late January 1943, with crossings of the Upper Donets and rapid advances through Volchansk and Chuguyev. By mid-February, Soviet spearheads reached the city's outer districts. German rear services tried to evacuate depots and hospitals, but the pace of the advance exceeded initial estimates. Fighting at the approaches involved combined arms push and clear tactics along rail embankments and factory zones on the eastern and northeastern arcs. On February 16th, Soviet forces entered central Kharkiv. Street combat was short compared with later actions. Organized German withdrawal routes remained open to the southwest, and formations disengaged to avoid encirclement. Soviet reports recorded the capture of stores and rolling stock not removed in time. German reports noted demolition of bridges and warehouses that could not be evacuated. Civilian administration changed rapidly, with city committees reestablished, police structures reconfigured, and emergency services restarted on the basis of available personnel and equipment. The liberation did not end fighting in the region. The winter advance stretched supply lines from Voronezh and Kursk. Bridges over the Donets and Oskol were overused, and road nets suffered from thaw conditions. 3rd Tank Army's vehicles required maintenance after weeks of operations. Rifle divisions were below establishment after continuous attacks. German High Command transferred the SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser and other mobile elements from refitting areas to the Belgorod-Kharkiv corridor. By late February, a counteroffensive plan under Erich von Manstein sought to stabilize the front by striking exposed Soviet salients and restoring a shorter line anchored on the Donets Bend. The immediate objective near Kharkiv was to separate 3rd Tank Army from 69th Army, defeat them in detail, and retake the city to regain the rail hinge for further operations. Operational density in early March 1943 reached its peak around the city. The SS Panzer Corps, reinforced by divisions equipped with a mix of Panzer IVs with long 75mm guns, earlier Panzer IIIs, assault guns, and limited Tigers in separate companies, moved from the southwest and west. German mobile strength committed to the Kharkiv sector is assessed in the several hundred operational tanks and assault guns, backed by infantry divisions and artillery, with improved ammunition supply once rail links were restored to Belgorod. Soviet defending forces inside and around the city comprised depleted rifle divisions, tank brigades with reduced serviceable vehicles, and artillery repositioned to cover expected axes of approach. Air operations intensified as weather windows opened. Both sides flew ground attack and interdiction sorties aimed at junctions and bridges. From March 7th onward, German thrusts cut roads leading into the city from the north and northeast. Village strongpoints on the ring roads changed control multiple times as each side sought to secure lateral movement. By March 10th to 12th, pressure narrowed Soviet entry routes to a few streets under direct fire. The decision calculus for both commands converged on whether to defend across the entire urban area or to consolidate on selected districts to conserve forces. Soviet staffs authorized withdrawals from outer neighborhoods to avoid encirclement inside factories and rail yards, while attempting to hold crossings over the Lopan and Udi long enough to move heavy weapons. German staffs prioritized clearing road corridors that allowed armor to pass in column and avoided blockages by destroyed trams, rail cars, and debris. Street fighting escalated on March 12th to 14th in industrial zones and central squares. Engagements featured company and battalion groups, supported by direct-fire artillery at short ranges. Barricades and anti-tank obstacles forced detours. Assault detachments advanced house by house, with engineers clearing passages. Civilian risk increased as combat crossed residential streets. Evacuations were ad hoc, with groups moving between lines during lulls or sheltering in basements until sectors changed hands. Medical stations operated close to front lines to shorten evacuation paths. Both sides reported high evacuation loads and shortages of dressings and plasma. Ammunition expenditure in urban combat exceeded daily forecasts, particularly for high-explosive shells. Supply parties used night routes to move crates from railheads to firing positions. On March 14th to 15th, German units seized key nodes in central Kharkiv, including administrative squares and the main rail approaches. Soviet forces disengaged toward the northeast and east to avoid being trapped west of the Donets. By March 16th, organized resistance inside the city had ended, though small groups continued to exfiltrate at night for several days. The result was the third transfer of control since 1941. Comparative loss figures for the March fighting remain contested, but records indicate several thousand casualties on each side in the urban phase alone, with additional losses in the encirclement and approach battles north and west of the city. Tank losses were substantial relative to the scale of forces engaged, reflecting the demands of street combat and counterattacks against flanks. For logistics and administration, the immediate aftermath required rapid reconfiguration. German authorities restored traffic control, cleared debris from main roads, and resumed rail dispatch within days on selected tracks, prioritizing ammunition and fuel for formations still maneuvering against Soviet forces north of the city. Workshops assessed captured vehicles and artillery. Usable items were pressed into service or sent to rear depots. Civilian labor details expanded under new directives, and identification regimes returned to occupation norms. On the Soviet side of the line, formations that withdrew reorganized east of the Donets, integrating replacements and absorbing new vehicles from factories that, by spring 1943, were producing at higher rates than a year earlier. Strategically, the March recapture did not end the contest for the node. The German counteroffensive restored an operational line shorter and better supplied than the one of mid-February, but it did not remove the larger pressure building along the Kursk salient. For Soviet command, the loss of the city after a brief liberation underscored the risks of overextension and the need to synchronize armor, artillery, and logistics over thaw-affected terrain. For civilians, 2 regime changes within 1 month produced repeated shifts in documentation, rationing, and policing, with workplaces reopening under different rules and with shifting labor categories. The peak of the Kharkiv fighting thus consisted of linked operations, winter advance, urban battle, and counteroffensive that maximized the city's dual character as a battlefield and a rail apparatus, and set conditions for the next reversal later in 1943, when wider strategic concentrations would again place Kharkiv at the intersection of converging fronts. Between March and July 1943, Kharkiv functioned as a pivot where each side adapted under pressure from losses, terrain, and supply constraints. German commands reconstituted the formations that had retaken the city in mid-March, rotating SS Panzer Corps into rest and refit areas west of Kharkiv, while line infantry held the urban perimeter and the Donets crossings. Divisions received replacements and vehicles from depots that prioritized Panzer IVs with long 75mm guns and assault guns, while limited numbers of heavy tanks were grouped in company strength. Ammunition stocks were rebuilt to prepare for a summer offensive north of Belgorod, and engineer units expanded fieldworks along the approaches to the city with anti-tank ditches, mine belts, and wire obstacles tied to fire plans. Fuel remained the critical variable. Allocation tables assigned daily issues that covered routine patrolling and limited training, but large concentration moves required rail deliveries synchronized with narrow windows, when Luftwaffe cover could be guaranteed. Soviet forces adapted on a broader arc. Losses in the winter and March fighting led Stavka to rationalize command boundaries. Voronezh Front held the line north and northwest of Kharkiv, while Steppe Front assembled reserves in depth around Kursk, Oboyan, and Belgorod. Tank armies were rebuilt with standardized brigades and attached self-propelled artillery, including Su-76 and Su-122 units, to increase combined arms firepower at divisional level. Rifle divisions were replenished to nearer establishment strengths, though many remained below table numbers. Artillery groupings concentrated guns to support breakthrough sectors. Logistic reforms emphasized forward fuel dumps by rail to interchange yards, then by truck to field depots within 20 to 30 kilometers of the start lines, a change from earlier reliance on river crossings vulnerable to interdiction. Air armies redistributed squadrons to cover railheads, bridges, and assembly areas, with fighter regiments tasked to protect daylight freight corridors during the buildup. Inside occupied Kharkiv, administration tightened controls to feed the military system while containing the risks of disruption. Labor registries expanded to include workshops repairing rolling stock, field kitchens, and small arms. Ration scales remained tiered, with registered heavy laborers receiving higher allocations than dependents. Unregistered residents relied on markets where prices fluctuated with train arrivals. Identification checks at stations and depots increased, and curfews were aligned with freight movement. Civil defense maintained shelters and fire brigades during periodic air alerts. For civilians, adaptation meant navigating documentation changes, work assignments linked to specific depots or shops, and unpredictable transport, as passenger movement ceded priority to military freight. Partisan activity in the wider Kharkiv region sought to exploit this logistical dependency rather than confront garrisons directly. Groups targeted isolated bridges, telegraph lines, and culverts to delay trains by hours rather than days, calculating that cumulative delays would reduce frontline ammunition issues during peak operations. German rear area commands responded with patrols and fortified guard posts on key stretches, plus railway security trains. The result was a contest measured less in large engagements than in dispatch statistics, repair times, and spare part consumption for locomotives and wagons. Doctrinal adaptation occurred on both sides. German defense near Kharkiv adopted elastic patterns, forward outposts to fix attackers, main resistance lines positioned to force tank forces into pre-sighted anti-tank fields, and mobile groups held for short counterthrusts. Assault gun batteries were assigned to village strongpoints where streets and embankments restricted maneuver. Soviet practice emphasized reconnaissance in force to identify weak sectors, massed artillery preparation, time to suppress anti-tank guns, and immediate commitment of second-echelon tank brigades to widen breaches before reserves could counterattack. Coordination improved between tank, infantry, and engineers in urban and semi-urban terrain, with sapper detachments carrying fascines and explosive charges to clear obstacles at road junctions and rail cuttings. Psychological stresses were managed through messaging tied to measurable outputs. German orders circulated daily figures for trains dispatched, wagons unloaded, and guns repaired to support unit confidence that supplies would meet operational plans. Soviet political departments used metrics for locomotives repaired, bridges rebuilt, and tanks delivered from plants east of the Volga to sustain expectations for summer operations. Medical services on both sides adapted evacuation and triage procedures based on lessons from March Street fighting, assigning aid stations closer to likely engagement zones and allocating additional stretcher teams for urban sectors where vehicle access was restricted. The July battle at Kursk altered the adaptation calculus. German offensive power peaked north and south of the salient. By mid-July, counterattacks on the Oral and Belgorod sectors put German formations on the defensive. For Kharkiv, this shift meant that the city would again become a hinge in a larger maneuver. Army Group South began phased withdrawals from advanced positions north of Belgorod to shorten the line and to preserve armor. The SS Panzer Corps redeployed to cover approaches toward the city, while engineer units prepared successive delay lines on the northwestern and northern arcs. Rail dispatch from Kharkiv prioritized ammunition and fuel to mobile rearguards and evacuation of serviceable equipment from depots that would otherwise be captured. Soviet planning for Operation Rumyantsev adapted lessons from earlier failures around the city. Instead of seeking an immediate encirclement inside the urban ring, the plan aimed to break German lines north and northwest of Kharkiv, seize Belgorod, and push south to cut lateral roads before turning on the city. Forces allocated included tank and mechanized corps, grouped under 5th Guards Tank Army, and supporting rifle armies with concentrated artillery. Air support plans emphasized interdiction of road columns and strikes on rail junctions feeding the Kharkiv hub. Logistics tables scheduled high daily tonnages of fuel and ammunition, with multiple crossing points over the Donets to avoid single-node dependence. Civilians prepared for another transition without certainty over timing or outcome. Those with work ties to rail and depot functions continued under occupation directives, while others sought to move east or to rural areas ahead of potential fighting. Hospitals increased stocks of dressings and blood substitutes. Municipal services pre-positioned firefighting equipment at risk points on the rail ring and in factory districts. The city's built environment, rail embankments, cuttings, and multi-track yards, remained both asset and hazard, offering cover for defenders and corridors for attackers, depending on which side controlled the approaches. By late July, the adaptation phase had converged toward renewed offensive and defensive roles. German units around Kharkiv had rebuilt cohesion, but faced reduced operational depth and lower fuel margins than in early 1943. Soviet formations had increased standardized equipment, artillery density, and air support relative to the winter operations, and had adjusted objectives to control the road and rail geometry before entering the urban area. Both sides accounted for the civilian dimension in planning, primarily as a variable affecting movement and labor allocation, rather than as a separate objective. The mechanisms of resistance and adaptation, rear area security and sabotage, doctrinal shifts in urban and approach fighting, resource management of fuel, shells, and rolling stock, and measures to sustain morale through quantifiable goals, define the period between March and late July, and set the stage for the turning movement aimed at the city in August 1943. Operation Rumyantsev opened before dawn on August 3, 1943, as Voronezh Front on the right and Steppe Front on the left struck south from the Belgorod sector toward Kharkiv. The operational grouping combined rifle armies with tank and mechanized armies for rapid exploitation. Voronezh Front committed 5th Guards Army, 6th Guards Army, and 5th Guards Tank Army. Steppe Front aligned 53rd Army, 69th Army, 7th Guards Army, 1st Tank Army, and 5th Guards Mechanized Corps. Initial artillery densities averaged 120 to 150 guns and mortars per kilometer on breakthrough sectors, with assault aviation tasked to suppress known anti-tank positions along the Belgorod-Kharkiv highway and the Bogodukov rail axis. Force totals for both fronts in the operation's opening phase exceeded 700,000 personnel, over 1,700 tanks and self-propelled guns, and more than 1,000 aircraft. Opposing German groupings under 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf fielded several panzer and infantry divisions, with operational armored strength in the low hundreds and reduced infantry effectives following July's fighting. The immediate objective was to rupture the German belt north of Belgorod, seize the city, and create a westward bend through Bogodukov to outflank Kharkiv from the northwest and west, before turning southeast against the urban perimeter. Belgorod fell on August 5th after 2 days of combined arms pressure that pushed German forces onto delay lines oriented on road and rail cuttings. Soviet tank and mechanized corps then advanced 20 to 35 kilometers in the first 48 hours along multiple axes, generating gaps between German strongpoints. The German response concentrated available mobile reserves, elements of 2nd SS Panzer Corps and Army Panzer divisions, against Soviet spearheads northwest of Kharkiv, particularly in the Bogodukov-Akhtirka sector, aiming to cut the base of the Soviet salient and to restore a continuous front. The counterattacks between August 6th and August 12th formed the turning point's hinge. German armored groups executed short, repeated thrusts that targeted the flanks of Soviet tank corps, forcing redeployment and exposing supply echelons. Engagement ranges varied with terrain. Open fields allowed long-range gunnery by Panzer IVs with long 75mm guns and assault guns, while villages and rail embankments produced close-quarter fights with high ammunition, expenditure, and high explosive and armor-piercing rounds. On several days, German units recaptured localities taken earlier that morning, only to yield them again under afternoon artillery concentrations. Soviet staffs committed second echelon formations, additional tank brigades and rifle divisions, to widen corridors and protect logistics. Air operations intensified as weather permitted. Fighter sorties escorted ground attack aircraft against road columns and bridges feeding German counterattack routes. Logistics determined tempo. Soviet supply tables planned daily issues of fuel and ammunition sufficient for 40 to 60 kilometers of mechanized movement. But dust, traffic density, and bridge constraints reduced actual delivery rates. Corps trained on improved march discipline still experienced delays at choke points where multiple columns converged. German supply margins were narrower, fuel stocks supported counterthrusts, but limited sustained pursuit after local successes. Railheads pulled back from Belgorod required rapid repair. Engineer units on both sides worked under artillery and air threat to restore culverts and switching gear. By August 12th to 14th, the momentum shifted as Soviet formations held ground against the last major German counterstrokes in the Bogodukov sector and generated additional pressure south of the highway. 1st Tank Army and 5th Guards Tank Army pushed east and southeast to interdict lateral roads leading into Kharkiv, while Steppe Front's rifle armies advanced on a wider arc to force German units off positions that anchored the city's northern and western defenses. The operational map now showed a converging movement, one prong turning in from the northwest, another pressing from the north, with a third developing southwest of the city to compromise withdrawal routes through Marefa. German command recalibrated objectives from restoring the line to delaying and extracting formations. Orders emphasized holding successive lines to enable an organized withdrawal from the urban perimeter without encirclement. Rear services began staged evacuation of depots, hospitals, and repair shops inside Kharkiv. Engineer units prepared demolitions on bridges over the Lopan, Udi, and within the rail ring to slow pursuit. Street defenses were organized around strong points at factory complexes and major squares, with assault guns positioned to deny straight approaches along broad avenues and rail cuttings. Soviet entry into Kharkiv's outer districts began on August 18th to 19th, with reconnaissance in force and limited assaults to test strong points. Artillery registered targets on administrative and industrial nodes used as command and logistics hubs. Infantry advanced behind rolling barrages, and sappers cleared barricades at intersections. The plan did not seek a rapid crossing of the entire city in one blow. Instead, it aimed to compress the perimeter, cut road exits, and force the defender either to commit reserves inside the city, where they risked isolation, or to withdraw before the ring closed. Across August 20th to 22nd, rifle divisions tightened control over northern and western neighborhoods, while tank and mechanized units bypassed pockets to block routes leading south and southwest. Civilian conditions reflected the transition. Identification checks, curfews, and work assignments under occupation rules persisted until sectors shifted. Then emergency administrations reopened utilities, organized firefighting details for shell-damaged districts, and directed flows of displaced residents away from active streets. Hospitals worked above capacity on both sides of the line. Ambulance routes changed daily as control of road segments shifted. Rail movement for civilians remained extremely limited. The yards prioritized military dispatch and evacuation of equipment, with trains operating under constant threat from air attacks and artillery. On August 22nd to 23rd, German commands executed a controlled withdrawal from central sectors to avoid being trapped west of the Donets. Demolitions cut key bridges and segments of the rail ring. Rear guards delayed with mines and roadblocks, while main forces exited along routes screened by night movements and local counterattacks. Soviet formations entered central Kharkiv on August 23rd, securing administrative centers, stations, and crossings in sequence. Mopping up continued for several days as isolated groups attempted to break out or hide in industrial zones. The city changed the hands for the fourth time since 1941. Comparative outcomes illustrate why this phase constitutes the turning point. In the Belgorod-Kharkiv operation, Soviet fronts achieved their stated objectives: capture of Belgorod, retaking of Kharkiv, and displacement of German forces onto a shorter line south and west of the city, while retaining sufficient armored strength to continue offensive action toward the Dnipro. German forces preserved a portion of their mobile units by avoiding encirclement inside Kharkiv, but their operational depth in the region was reduced, and the rail and road geometry that had supported earlier counteroffensives now favored the attacker. Lost data from both sides' daily and weekly reports show high personnel and equipment attrition during August, with tank write-offs and artillery expenditure consistent with continuous combined arms fighting. Precise totals vary by source, but the balance left Soviet formations with larger effective armored groupings in the immediate aftermath. For command practice, the August fighting validated several adjustments. Soviet staffs demonstrated improved synchronization between artillery, armor, and engineers in breaching anti-tank belts and in urban approach fighting, and they managed multiple axes to stretch German reserves. German staffs executed disciplined counterattacks that imposed delays and inflicted losses, but fuel and force ratios constrained the duration and reach of these actions. The end state on August 23rd produced immediate military and civilian effects. Kharkiv's rail hub shifted to feed an advancing front, city administration re-established services under wartime rules, and population movements reversed as residents returned to districts where fighting had ceased, while others left areas still exposed to shelling. This turning point did not conclude the campaign in eastern Ukraine, but it fixed the direction. With Kharkiv secured and German formations withdrawing toward the Dnipro bend, subsequent operations would emphasize pursuit, crossings, and the reconstitution of units for riverline battles. The city's status as a node persisted, now aligned to the offensive, and its recent history of repeated capture and recapture informed both military planning and civilian expectations for the months ahead. The withdrawal from Kharkiv on August 23, 1943, initiated a phased German retreat toward the Dnipro line, while Soviet commands reorganized the city into a forward logistics base. Rearguards west and southwest of the urban perimeter executed delay actions at river crossings and road junctions, using minefields, short counterattacks, and bridge demolitions to slow pursuit. Engineer units cut spans on the Lopan and Udi and prepared charges on culverts along the routes to Marefa and Krasnorad. Mobile formations, reduced by August fighting, were assigned to cover columns carrying artillery, signals equipment, and hospital stores. Fuel allocation orders prioritized exit routes. Trains loaded with depots and workshops moved through nighttime windows to reduce exposure to interdiction. The objective was to reach interim positions around Poltava and Kremenchuk, and then consolidate on the Panther-Wotan line along the Dnipro. Soviet pursuit unfolded on converging lines. Tank and mechanized corps advanced through Bogodukov and toward Valky and Poltava, while rifle armies followed to clear bypassed localities and secure logistics corridors. Bridging units rebuilt crossings on the northern and western outskirts of Kharkiv to resume rail and motor traffic into the city. Forward repair detachments opened workshops in captured depots, and reconnected power and water where damage allowed. The priority set by front headquarters was to restore rail operations to a level that could sustain daily issues of ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies for armies moving west. Through late August and early September, traffic increased from a handful of military trains per day to more than a dozen, with alternating schedules for outbound supply and inbound evacuation of wounded and damaged equipment. Inside the city, administration shifted to wartime municipal routines designed around essential services and security screening. Utility crews repaired main lines first. Residential branches followed as materials became available. Hospitals consolidated in buildings with intact roofs and reliable water, absorbing casualties from the urban fighting and the pursuit westward. Public health measures included chlorination points, latrine construction, and vaccination campaigns to prevent typhus and dysentery. Food distribution transitioned from ad hoc field kitchens to ration card issues tied to workplace registration. Housing authorities inventoried damaged structures and assigned temporary accommodations in schools and offices for residents displaced by shelling or demolitions. Labor mobilization drew on factory workers, railwaymen, and students for debris clearance, railbed repair, and sandbagging around pumping stations. Security organs instituted document checks and registration for residents of working age. Commissions examined cases involving wartime employment under occupation, police service, or administrative roles. Procedures varied by category. Some individuals returned immediately to industrial and municipal work after registration. Others were detained for investigation. These processes affected labor availability in the first weeks, requiring reallocation of tasks among workshops and construction brigades. Alongside screening, amnesty provisions for certain categories of compulsory wartime labor were used to stabilize the workforce in critical sectors such as rail, power, and water. Military units transferred captured material to collection points for inspection and reuse. Locomotives, wagons, and serviceable trucks left in the yards were inventoried. Usable items were pressed into NKPS and Army service, while damaged stock was cannibalized for parts. Engineer troops and civilian specialists cleared thousands of mines and unexploded shells from rail verges, factory yards, and major streets, a process that continued for months and determined which districts could be reopened safely. Fire brigades addressed smoldering depots and warehouses to prevent secondary damage to adjacent infrastructure. The humanitarian situation reflected both the cumulative effect of repeated battles and the specific disruptions of August. Casualty lists from the urban fighting and the approach battles included soldiers from multiple fronts and civilians hit during shelling or trapped in collapsing buildings. Burial teams operated under municipal direction to process identified and unidentified dead. Record-keeping supported later notifications and claims. Medical supply tables showed shortages of plasma, sulfa drugs, and anesthetics. Priority went to surgical cases and to returning lightly wounded personnel to duty in rail repair and transport units. Displaced persons sought reunification with family members. Registration centers recorded names and last known addresses to facilitate searches across recently liberated districts. Propaganda and public communication framed the transition in ways that intersected with practical concerns. Announcements specified curfew hours, required documents for movement, and procedures for reporting unexploded ordnance. Posters and broadcasts highlighted the reopening of tram lines on limited routes, the restoration of water to certain neighborhoods, and the dispatch of the first trains west after bridge repairs. Military bulletins credited units for participation in the city's recapture and reported progress of the pursuit toward the Dnipro. On the German side, communiques emphasized an orderly withdrawal and claimed the establishment of new defensive lines. Internal orders focused on reconstituting divisions, repairing vehicles, and stockpiling ammunition on the river line. Comparative force conditions in September 1943 underline the operational consequences of the withdrawal. German formations in the Kharkiv Poltava sector reorganized with reduced infantry strengths and armor counts that reflected August attrition. Replacements arrived unevenly, and fuel remained constrained. Soviet armies operating from the Kharkiv railhead had growing artillery densities and access to a rebuilt truck pool, but their tank brigades also required maintenance after prolonged movement, and bridges over the Donets and Vorskla created natural bottlenecks. Air forces on both sides adjusted focus from urban support to interdiction of bridges and stations along the retreat and pursuit axes. The result was a race dictated as much by rail repair, road capacity, and fuel delivery as by remaining combat strength. Civil-military interaction in the weeks after liberation followed a pattern shaped by necessity. Factories that could be restarted did so with limited power and partial workforces. Others served as repair sites for weapons and vehicles. Schools reopened in phases where buildings and staff were available. In many districts, classrooms functioned as dormitories for repair crews or as auxiliary clinics. Courts resumed operations with dockets containing property disputes, labor registrations, and cases arising from the occupation period. The police reorganized patrols to control theft from warehouses and to maintain order near stations where food and supplies were most visible. By mid-September, Kharkiv's role in withdrawal and aftermath had stabilized into a forward staging and repair hub aligned to westward offensives. Rail dispatch reached sustained levels sufficient to supply multiple armies. Truck columns moved on improved schedules, coordinated with bridge capacities and daylight restrictions. Evacuation trains carried wounded east to hospitals beyond the range of frontline air raids. Hospital trains brought medical supplies and staff back to the city. Fuel storage resumed in dispersed tanks rather than large depots to limit risk from air attack. Ammunition dumps followed similar dispersion patterns with marked lanes and blast berms. These measures increased handling time but reduced losses. The German retreat continued toward the Dnipro crossings at Kremenchuk, Dnipro-Dzerzhinsk, and Dnipropetrovsk, with rearguards trying to keep pace with demolition parties and engineer detachments. Soviet bridging units rehearsed river crossing drills, while rail brigades extended the standard gauge conversion and repair cycle toward Poltava and beyond. Kharkiv's repeated transitions since 1941 had left a layered legacy of partially repaired structures, reused depots, and neighborhoods rebuilt under different authorities. In the immediate aftermath of August 1943, that legacy became an advantage. Experienced railwaymen, engineers, and administrators applied routines learned in previous cycles to restore essential services faster than in earlier phases. The withdrawal and its aftermath thus produced parallel outcomes. Militarily, the city's capture enabled a sustained advance toward the Dnipro and denied the defender a logistics hinge in northeastern Ukraine. Administratively, the return of municipal functions and the recalibration of labor and security allowed a measure of urban stability under wartime conditions. Humanitarianly, the cost of repeated transfers of control remained visible in casualty lists, displacement, and material loss, even as services resumed. The lines of retreat and pursuit moved westward, but Kharkiv's rail geometry and industrial core continued to shape the conduct of operations and the pace of civilian recovery, long after the last rearguard left the city limits. Across 1941 to 43, Kharkiv's 4 transfers of control created a pattern that shaped regional operations, institutional learning, and civilian policy for the remainder of the war. The sequence: German capture on October 24th to 25th, 1941. Soviet entry on February 16th, 1943. German recapture on March 16, 1943. Soviet liberation on August 23, 1943. Mapped directly onto evolving strategic concepts. For the German side, the city illustrated both the utility and the limits of a rail-centered operational design. When throughput targets were met, formations near the Donets and toward the Don and Volga received fuel and ammunition at rates sufficient for offensive action. When bridges, switching yards, and locomotive pools fell short, operations narrowed to counterstrokes and delay lines. For the Soviet side, the same node underpinned reconstitution in 1941 to 42, a temporary overextension in early 1943, and coordinated fronts in summer 1943 that combined artillery density, armor mass, and rail repair in a single timetable. The city's rail geometry remained the decisive constant. Lines to Belgorod and Kursk, to Poltava and the Dnipro corridor, to Kupiansk and the Oskol-Donets approaches, and to Lozova and the Donbass dictated maneuver options more reliably than unit counts alone. Every change of hands featured a race between demolition and repair. Railroad pioneers converting 1,520 millimeters to 1,435 millimeters in late 1941 aimed at daily rates of 20 to 30 kilometers where intact bridges allowed. In 1943, NKPS brigades sought to return double track and water towers to service fast enough to issue 12 to 24 military trains per day. These technical numbers determined artillery allotments, fuel columns, and hospital train capacity. Command memoranda on both sides repeatedly tied operational choices to specific yards, culverts, and water stations. Industrial evacuation and reuse linked pre-war assets to wartime production trajectories. In autumn 1941, machine tools and skilled laborers leaving Kharkiv contributed to tank and locomotive output in Nizhny Tagil and other rear plants by mid-1942, offsetting the loss of plant floors captured or damaged in the city. During occupations, workshops in Kharkiv repaired rolling stock, weapons, and vehicles. After liberation, the same facilities supported Soviet repair and refit. The measurable effect appeared in the force composition of 1943 to 44. Standardized tank brigades equipped from re-established production lines and regiments with more uniform artillery calibers improved supply and maintenance. Kharkiv's factories returned to partial output under constraints of power, raw materials, and labor, with roles shifting from original manufacturing to repair and sub-assembly as the front moved west. Casualty data across the four phases remain a focus of historical debate, but comparative ranges indicate the human cost of the node's volatility. The May 1942 encirclement associated with the failed Soviet Kharkiv offensive produced losses assessed above 200,000 on the attacking side across killed, wounded, and captured, with German and Allied losses in the sector noted in the tens of thousands. The February-March 1943 urban fighting registered several thousand casualties on each side within the city, plus additional losses in surrounding maneuver battles. August in 1943 combined the Belgorod breakthrough, the Bogodukov counterattacks, and urban entry, with high attrition in armored and artillery units for both sides. Civilian mortality and displacement coincided with shelling, building collapses, disease spikes after water disruption, and the hazards of mines and unexploded munitions that persisted through late 1943. Municipal records from the first months after liberation point to extensive clearance operations as a prerequisite for reopening districts. Administrative practice changed with each regime while retaining recurrent tasks: ration administration, tied to registered labor categories, identity screening, curfews synchronized with freight movements, and the direction of work brigades toward rail and utility repair. Screening commissions after liberation addressed wartime employment under occupation, alongside immediate labor needs. The results influenced reconstruction speed as much as policy goals, since the availability of railwaymen, electricians, and metal workers decided whether depots and pumping stations could resume service on schedules that supported ongoing operations to the west. Operational lessons from Kharkiv fed into doctrine. German staffs extrapolated from March 1943 that urban re-entry was feasible if mobile groups cut road nets first and if demolitions delayed counterattacks from the periphery. Fuel constraints repeatedly capped the depth of exploitation after tactical success. Soviet staffs derived the converse lesson in August 1943, that encirclement inside large cities was avoidable if exit routes were cut outside the perimeter, and if multiple axes forced defenders to choose between urban strongpoints and maneuver space. Artillery planning shifted toward higher densities on breakthrough sectors with attention to suppressing anti-tank belts, while engineer support standardized obstacle reduction in rail and factory zones. Air tasking on both sides moved from primarily interdiction in 1942 to tightly coordinated ground attack windows during 1943 urban approaches, reflecting higher aircraft serviceability and better ground-air communication. The city's legacy in the wider campaign was immediate. With Kharkiv secured in August 1943, rail and road supply enabled sustained Soviet operations toward the Dnipro crossings at Kremenchuk and Dnipropetrovsk. German withdrawals used delay lines calculated against bridge building and rail repair rates. The operational value of holding intermediate towns diminished once Kharkiv's node was oriented to the attacker. In this sense, the recapture did not end Kharkiv's military role, but changed its function from contested hinge to forward staging base. The flow of trains, ambulances, and refit columns through its yards in September-October 1943 formed a measurable bridge between summer operations and riverline battles. Memory and commemoration followed logistical reality, but introduced additional perspectives. Numbered operations recount military histories with emphasis on orders of battle, dates, and loss tables. Municipal narratives record evacuation lists, shelter locations, and the reopening of schools and trams, providing a civilian chronology aligned with front maps, but organized around utilities and workplaces. Post-war memorials mark dates corresponding to the four turnovers and to casualty events during the encirclement and urban combats. Debates in scholarship address attribution of responsibility for failed offensives, the weight of rail repair versus unit quality in determining outcomes, and the interaction between occupation policies and labor availability for infrastructure tasks. These debates share a methodological premise that Kharkiv's experience is best reconstructed through quantifiable data on rail capacity, ammunition issues, unit strengths, and administrative measures rather than through generalized characterizations. The city's built environment retains traces of this period in alignments of track, siting of depots, and the distribution of late-war industrial facilities. Zoning and transport plans in the immediate post-war years incorporated wartime lessons about dispersion of fuel storage and the prioritization of repair access to bridges and water stations. Demographic recovery curves, measured in registered residence and workplace rosters, show the lag between military liberation and full restoration of urban functions. The repeated transitions during 1941 to 43 compressed planning horizons, but they also produced cadres of administrators, engineers, and workers accustomed to rapid change under constraint, an institutional resource for later reconstruction. Kharkiv's wartime record thus occupies a dual place in the history of the Eastern Front. At the operational level, it demonstrates how a single rail hub can shape campaigns through measurable capacities and repair cycles, and how capture without secured approaches risks reversal. At the societal level, it documents the interdependence of military timetables and civilian systems in a large industrial city. The fourfold capture and recapture did not assign fixed roles of heroism or culpability. It distributed movement and stasis according to rails, rivers, depots, and decisions that can be dated and quantified. The city that would not stay won did not do so by narrative choice, but by the arithmetic of transport and force that governed a theater where strategic intent passed repeatedly through the same yards, bridges, and streets.